All right, so we're going to jump in. So we're going to look at the two sides that begin to form when we talk about fighting and participation in World War II. Okay, so after Germany violates the Non-Aggression Pact, we're going to see that the Soviet Union is going to join the side of the Allies. Okay, so we see three main Axis powers. And again, we see these as the countries who took kind of aggressive actions early on. So we talk about Germany invading in Europe, Italy invading in Ethiopia, and then Japan taking over in Manchuria, China. Okay, the Allies, we're going to see Britain, France, Soviet Union, China, and then the United States, which is going to join in a little bit later. When we talk about these, obviously there were several other countries that participated. These are going to be kind of the main power players that we look at. Okay, again, this is something that you don't have to write down, but when we look at those three countries, they were very power and land hungry when we referring to the Axis powers. So really their goal was to rule the world. Okay, they wanted to take over land. They wanted to gain control that way. Okay, again, this is not something that you have to write down, but I want you to understand kind of the mind frame that the United States was on leading into World War II and even in the early stages of World War II. Okay, so remember, our policy at the very beginning of the war was going to be isolationism, and then we move into this idea of kind of being neutral. Okay, so again, in this poll, in 1940, again in the early stage of the war, that if Germany was defeating England and France, should the United States declare war on Germany and send our army and navy to Europe to fight against Hitler? Only 23% of the people who polled said yes. Okay, so early on, again, Americans do not want to participate in the war. Okay, so our focus is going to be, okay, what's transitioning in the war that's going to change the United States policy? What's going to make us enter the war? Okay, so remember, FDR is still president at this point. Okay, so in his third term, he's going to give the State of the Union address, and he gives this forced freedom speech. Okay, so again, this is low key calling out Germany and the Axis powers, and he's basically saying that all people of the world should be granted these four freedoms: the freedom of speech, the freedom to worship, the freedom from want. So again, having like basic needs, and the freedom from fear. Okay, so although we're neutral, we start to see how the United States is clearly going to side with the Allied powers. Okay, so again, very similar to what we talked about in World War I, when we were sending supplies to Britain, but we were saying that we were neutral, so clearly Germany was against us. This is going to be very similar. Okay, so early on, we create the cash and carry policy. Okay, this is easy to remember because it's exactly like what it sounds. Okay, any country who was against the Axis power was allowed to buy war materials from us, but the two conditions were, okay, you had to pay cash and you had to carry it. So they had to pick up supplies. We were not going to transport goods. Again, it would be very dangerous for us to transport goods across the Atlantic Ocean. And again, so this is kind of the early stages of us ending neutrality policy. We've clearly taken a side. We just do not want to get directly involved in the war yet. Okay, so again, this is kind of the beginning stages. We clearly are against the Axis powers and for the Allied powers, so we'll help them in small ways to get war supplies, but we are not full in it yet. Okay, the Lend-Lease Act is very similar to the cash and carry policy, but we kind of loosen up the restrictions. So FDR can exchange, lease, lend goods to any country that was in the best interest of the U.S. Again, this allows us to kind of justify the relationship that we have with the Allied powers. Okay, so again, we are not physically in the war at this point. We are not sending soldiers into Europe at this point. But clearly we have taken an economic side, and we are clearly against the Axis powers. Sorry, I don't like when it's in the bottom of the screen. Okay, another way, again, Lend-Lease Act, you definitely need to know. Cash and Carry Act, you definitely need to know. This is just another way that we are aiding the Allied powers. Britain is given 50 old battleships from World War One. And again, this is going to be used for the convoy system to ship goods. So just like we talked about in World War One, okay. So again, you have your cargo ship carrying the goods, carrying the war supplies across the Atlantic Ocean, and then you have the battleships that kind of surround them to protect them. Okay. Also, something that we've already seen in World War One is the Selective Service Act. This one's going to be a little bit different because this is going to be the first peacetime draft. So we were not officially at war when this goes into act, but clearly this shows that we are getting our military ready to go to war. Okay, so in this cartoon, you see Hitler over here. You're playing with dynamite, and then you see Uncle Sam with plan to lend Britain arms. Uncle Sam is saying at the bottom, if we will show, it would be dynamite if I didn't. Okay, so we're in this position. Okay, Hitler saying, if you're lending arms to Britain, you're calling for war against us, and Uncle Sam saying, well, we'd be letting our allied or our alliance down if we didn't help out. Okay, so we're kind of stuck in this position where we don't really want to go to war, but we're not having much of a choice at this point. Okay, the Atlantic Charter, this is an agreement created between FDR and the leader of Britain, Prime Minister Winston Churchill. And basically, they're coming together. This is going to be our main alliance. The United States and Britain is going to stand together to oppose Hitler and the Axis powers. In FDR's quarantine speech, again, and these are just kind of steps along the way where we're making it clear whose side we're on. In his quarantine speech, he's specifically calling out the Axis powers. And FDR at this point is trying to get the American people on board to join the war. Okay, so again, in order to participate with peace-loving countries, okay, in order to participate with the Allied powers, we have to quarantine, and we should all be super familiar about what that word quarantine means. We're all stuck in isolation. We need to quarantine. We need to cut off the aggressive Axis nations. Okay, so at the same time, we are lending war supplies to Britain. U-boat battles are happening again. So remember, we talked about the U-boats or the Untersee boats. They were attacking American ships. Okay, just like this is what brought us into World War One. This is going to help move the United States into the position to fight in World War Two. Okay, so again, as we take more of an economic stand against Germany, Germany's taking more of an aggressive military action stand against the United States. Okay, so remember, Japan had been taking aggressive actions as well. And United States and Japanese relations had become very tense. So remember, okay, we're kind of competing in the same territory when we talked about imperialism, because we also had territory in the Pacific. So remember, when Japan begins expanding, we have Pearl Harbor right here. Japan begins taking aggressive action in China and throughout the Pacific, and officially joins with the Axis powers. Okay, and then we're going to have the attack on Pearl Harbor. Okay, so the Japanese military leaders planned a surprise attack on December 7th, 1941, also known as the Day of Infamy. What is happening is, again, a majority of our naval fleet was at Pearl Harbor. Again, it was a great fueling station. And the Japanese are going to seek this opportunity to attempt to keep the United States out of the war by completely eliminating their naval ships. So again, roughly about 2 hours, consistent bombing over Pearl Harbor. And the Japanese, because it was a surprise attack, we were not able to retaliate or attack the planes that were bombing Pearl Harbor. So this did very little damage to Japan, but this was a devastating loss to the United States. Okay, so several reactions. Okay, first and foremost, when we talk about Pearl Harbor, this is the single event. Okay, we talked about a lot leading up to it, but Pearl Harbor, excuse me, is the act that is officially going to bring the United States into World War II. Okay, so the day after, Roosevelt asks Congress to declare war. They are at war with Japan. 3 days later, Germany and Italy, who are allied with Japan, declare war on the United States, bringing us into the war. Okay, in relation to this, okay, so remember where, I'm going to go back and look at the map, okay, where Hawaii was, okay, in the Pacific Ocean. And then again, we're going to see over here, if we extend the map out, this is going to be the west coast of the United States. Okay, so if Japan was going to attack anywhere, okay, they're going to attack along the Pacific Ocean, which is going to be along our west coast. Okay, so we definitely have concerns that Japan will attack even further inland into the United States. Because of this, we're going to see kind of this fear breakout over Japanese Americans. Okay, we were afraid that Japanese Americans along the west coast were going to be spies for Japan and could launch kind of an attack within the United States. Okay, so super important. FDR is going to issue Executive Order 9066. And what this executive order did was called for the internment of Japanese Americans. Okay, so any American that had Japanese descent was going to be removed from the West Coast and brought into internment camps. Okay, about 2/3 of these were U.S. citizens, were born within the United States. It did not matter. Okay, the fear of this was so strong that these people were sent to internment camps. Okay, so here's an example of kind of the barracks that people will be living in. Again, they are forced to kind of sell homes, sell businesses, relocate at the cost. Again, there was a lot of attacks in communities. Japanese were not welcome at all. So again, really poor living conditions. Okay, this is going to bring us to the Supreme Court case Korematsu versus the United States. Korematsu was a Japanese American who was ordered to be moved to internment camps, and he refused to obey the relocation order. So he is going to be arrested. His case has been appealed and appealed. It's brought all the way up to the Supreme Court. And again, this is one of the issues, guys, where it's being justified that during wartime, your individual liberties can be suspended. So, because of the threat from Japanese Americans due to the attack from Japan on Pearl Harbor, as unfortunate it was, Supreme Court is going to rule that this is a valid use of presidential power. Okay, so in the wartime, unfortunately, your individual liberties can be limited. And we're going to see that several other examples through the rest of American history that we look at. This is Korematsu and Bill Clinton. He issued a formal apology in the 90s, kind of addressing that issue and how, even though we may have thought it was right during World War II, that obviously his rights were violated.